Permits and inspections can get confusing as a homeowner. I know myself, before I got into being a building inspector, what do I need a permit for? What do I need inspections for? Do I really want an inspector out there looking at my stuff? If I don't have to, then maybe I wouldn't do it, right? And when it comes to pretty much any home project, for the most part, you need a permit for it. If you're altering anything, if you're adding anything, if you're finishing a basement, if you're building any type of addition or shop or garage, you're going to need a permit for it. For the most part, the only thing that doesn't require a permit would be some type of like facelift type upgrade. Paint, new cabinets, new flooring, maybe some new trim, some new doors. But technically, if you swap out your windows, if you put a new front door in, supposed to get a permit for it. And you're like, well, why do I have to get a permit for windows? I'm just taking them out and putting new ones in. Well, we don't know that. We don't know when we see new windows go in, we don't know if the window size got bigger. Well, if the window got bigger, well, then the support, the structural header above it would need to get bigger. So all of a sudden you have framing that needs to get looked at. I've had homeowners, even contractors, maybe they framed in a closet, right? They took an office and they said, I'm going to make it a bedroom. I put in a closet. So they framed like 2 or 3 little walls. I get it. It's like, why do I need a permit for that? Technically, if you're framing any walls, we would need to know, because we don't know what we don't see. As a jurisdiction, as a building department, as an inspector, we don't know if you tore something out. I mean, you could write on there, yeah, I'm just putting in a closet, but then if you didn't submit for the permit, we would never know that you did it, if that makes sense. A little confusing, but in a nutshell, if you frame a wall, if you're doing any type of addition, if you're swapping windows, if you're building a deck, if you're putting in a new front door, if you're putting on a roof cover over your deck, all that kind of stuff needs a permit. There's not very many things that are exempt from it. And I will show you what is, just so you have an idea. And you can always call down to your building department and you can ask them, and you can just say, hey, if I'm thinking about doing this, do I need a permit for it? And they'll tell you one way or another. Because on the flip side of it, I live out in a pretty rural area. I built a pole barn, and I asked them, okay, what do I need a permit for this? And they said, well, it's an accessory structure. It's technically, per the code book, would need a permit for it. But where I live, they said, well, if you stay 20 feet off of your property lines and 20 feet away from all structures, so pretty much 20 feet from everything, you don't need a permit. You just have to do a site plan. Okay. So I made sure I set it all up so that I was 20 feet away from everything. I did a site plan. I think I paid $20 to have them review my site plan and approve it. And I went and built my structure. I didn't need to call for any inspections. I didn't need to pay for a permit. Where I live, it wasn't required. Now, if I was to hop into the city where I work, they want a permit for everything. So any type of pole barn, they want to know where it's going because it's a more dense area. You're going to be closer to other houses. The fire hazard is greater. They don't want you filling your entire lot with structures. They want to make sure that there's green space, is what they might call it, is, grass, room for grass, driveways, plants, stuff like that. They don't want a concrete jungle, so they might monitor that. But that would be kind of a breakdown on permits, kind of a couple examples for you on whether or not you might need a permit or you might not. But really the code's pretty straightforward. If it's anything beyond just those facelift type items, you're going to need one. And so let's look at the code, and that way you kind of know where I'm pulling all this from. So here's permits, and it says any owner or owner's authorized agent who intends to construct, enlarge, alter, repair, move, demolish, or change the occupancy of the building or structure, or to erect, install, enlarge, alter, convert, replace. So here it says any electrical, gas, mechanical, or plumbing systems, the installation of which is regulated by this code. So again, they're talking about the IRC. So the IRC actually covers all of this, right? Depending on which chapters you got in the book, it talks about electrical, gas, mechanical, plumbing, and then the building side of it. It says in here, let's see, installation of which is regulated by this code, or to cause any such work to be performed shall first make application to the building official to obtain a required permit. So the verbiage is building official, but they just really mean the building department, because the building official governs the building department. And so here it kind of scrolls through work without a work exempt from a permit. So exemption from permit requirements of this code shall not be deemed to grant authorization for any work to be done in any manner in violation of the provisions of this code. So they're just saying, like, even though you don't have to get a permit, it doesn't mean that you're not required to build it safely. Like, you still need, if you build a deck and it's not required to have a permit, it still has to be safe. You don't want it to fall down and hurt somebody. And so here it says, so what's exempt from a permit as far as the building side of things? It says 1-story detached accessory structures, provided that the floor does not exceed 200 square feet. So you're definitely going to want to be off your property lines, at least 5 feet. If you start getting within 5 feet of the property lines, you get into rated walls, and you get into some requirements of being too close to your neighbor. But if you stay 5 feet off your property line, it's under 200 square feet, and it's under 1 story, you don't need a permit for it, which that would mostly be like sheds and stuff like that, right? Like you get like a pre-built tough shed of some sort, and you have it placed on the property, somewhere to store the lawnmower or something like that. Here they talk about fences not over 7 feet high, retaining walls not over 4 feet, but that's measured from the bottom of the footing. So if your frost depth, like where I'm at, is 2 feet, well, if your footing's 2 feet below grade, that means technically you can only have a retaining wall 2 feet above grade. Maybe you're down south and you don't have a frost depth. Well, technically they're saying in here, well, you can go build a 4-foot retaining wall and you're good to go. Sidewalks, driveways. Now, depending on where you live, again, it could change. Where I'm at, fence permits are required. Where I work, all the time. Where I live, I wouldn't get a permit if I did put a fence in. I didn't get a permit for it. I live out on, in a pretty rural area, and nobody's ever going to know the difference. But if I'm in a city where you could have issues with tall fences blocking the view of traffic and it could cause accidents, well, they want to regulate that. Sidewalks and driveways. I mean, if the city owns the sidewalk, well, they're going to want you to get a permit for it if you're trying to put in a new sidewalk, which is something they own. So here is more exemptions. So here we have, back to kind of the facelift stuff: painting, paper tile, prefabricated swimming pools, window awnings, and here's like decks not exceeding 200 square feet, not more than 30 inches, and not attached to the dwelling. So I talk a little bit more about that in the deck side of things and the deck component of this course. But in a nutshell, if you're building a deck, it's under 30 inches, it's under 200 square feet, just don't attach it to the house. Don't need a permit for it. Just needs to be built safely. So how about inspections, right? That's what I do. I show up, you guys call, say, hey, I've got something ready to look at. We come out to the site, we look at it. Maybe you've got some questions. We can show up and help you work through your project to make sure you're getting it down the right path. But that's all part of the inspection process. But in order for us to do inspections, we need plans. We need to know what it is that you were approved to do. So you would have gotten a permit. You would have submitted your construction documents. If and maybe it's something pretty simple and the building department didn't need approved plans. That may be the case. But depending on what you're doing, you might have something that maybe they sized some beams for you. Maybe they told you what insulation you needed or something like that. And we would look at it and say, okay, cool. This is what's been approved, and we're just going to verify that you did it that way. We'll help you answer some questions and try to keep you moving. So what is code requirements on inspections? What's typical? Well, as a nutshell, don't cover anything unless it's been inspected, or unless you've verified if it needs to be inspected. For homeowners, I run into this a lot where they put in a deck and they dug their footings down and they poured it and they built their whole deck and they said, hey, come out and look at my deck. And I said, well, I have to know that those footings are 2 feet deep. So now we got to dig along the side of them and we need to verify that they're 2 feet deep. And they might dig down and they say, well, I didn't know I had to be 2 feet deep. They're only 18 inches. It's like, okay, well, what do I do now? Now it's like, okay, well, do we add more footings? Do we undermine those and pour some more concrete? Does that mess with the structural components of the footing, the existing footing? How do you work through that, right? But if you knew, hey, just make a phone call, inspector comes out, he'll peek at it before you pour it and move on. So we would look at any footings, any foundations before you pour. We would look at your framing. We look at all your rough-in. Usually we don't look at framing until you're through all of your rough-in, which would be all your trades work, your electrical, mechanical, plumbing. All that stuff would be done, and then you would call for your framing inspection. That way we know if an electrician or somebody accidentally screwed through or put a big old hole in your floor joist or in a beam, we can say, well, that beam now has been compromised and now we need to have a structural fix for it. And you're thinking like, oh, really? But it's good to know, don't drill through your headers, don't drill through glue lam beams unless you know that you can do it. And even when it comes to studs and it comes to floor joists, there are specific areas where you're allowed to notch or bore holes. And if you do it in the wrong spot, you can mess with the integrity of it, which means you might have to sister another one next to it or figure out some type of fix to make sure that it's done correctly. Because the last thing you want is your floor to sag or to be squeaky or bouncy or, some type of issue. I mean, you want it to be nice and structurally sound. And so, as a nutshell, don't cover anything until it's been inspected. So you would go through all of your concrete. If you have it, you'd go through all your rough-in. You would get your framing. Then you would get an insulation inspection, at least on areas that you want to cover. So typically that's walls. You can't do the attic until you put the drywall up. So as an inspector, we normally would look at attic insulation and even sometimes crawl spaces at final because we can see it at any time. But the walls would be insulated, have the proper vapor barriers on them, and we'd come look at insulation. We'd verify baffles up in the ceiling, attic rulers, stuff like that for venting, and then you'd cover. And then you might, wherever you're at, they might have a drywall inspection. So they might want to look at the screw pattern, make sure you have so many screws per stud. Where I'm at, as an inspector, we don't look at drywall. It's not considered a structural component unless it's like shear rated. It's helps with like lateral shear movement. Typically on a residential house, you're not going to have that, especially with drywall. So we don't look at it. But I want to make you aware of it just in case. And then you'd have a final. After that, you finish everything up. You have your final inspection. The only other thing I can think of is maybe you're doing some siding and the inspector wants to see your building wrap before you site it. Or they want to see how your windows are sealed up and wrapped with window tape. There might be some exterior component inspections they might require. It just depends on your inspector. But again, if you call them up and ask them, they'll tell you one way or another. And at least where we work, we're pretty prompt. And so we're able to get out and take a look at it and keep you moving. Just understand what your building department requires. Because if they want you to call 2 days ahead of time, you want to make sure you get that call in so you're not being held up. So that when you get to those weekends and you want to work, that you're not like, oh, that dang inspector didn't show up. I didn't call in time. And so now you're stuck between, do you just keep moving or do you wait for him? The goal is to keep you moving so that you can get your project done in a timely manner. That kind of covers permits and inspections.